In this final presentation, Janice covers the legislation and its implications from 1971 to 2024. Janice first examines the fairness in the special education sector on immigrant children whose first language was not English and on working class boys. Janice then discusses the milestone 1978 Warnock Report coupled with the Education Act of 1981. Now, the United Nations Rights of the Child paper of 1981, the Human Rights Act 1998, the Equality Act of 2010, together with the 2014 Children and Families Act, provide a cornerstone to special educational needs and disability provisions for schools. Now, schools by law have to follow the Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice and its following amendments from 2014. We hope you find this video both useful and informative.
But as time went on, concerns arose about fairness in the special sector. I think in the second half of the 20th century, issues of human rights became more and more prominent. People considering across the whole piece, what is fair for all children in education? And it was noted that particular groups of children were being excluded from mainstream schools. For example, as numbers of people immigrated into this country from the West Indies, it was very clear that the assessment system meant that a disproportionate numbers of Black and working class boys were being sent out of mainstream to ESN and maladjusted schools. Bernard Coard, I think is from Grenada, he's certainly from the West Indies, wrote a very influential piece called How the West Indian Child is Made Educationally Subnormal in the British School System, the Scandal of the Black Child in Schools in Britain. And I think when we think about the way in which assessment is used, norm referenced assessment, it's not surprising that children who came to this country were assessed as non-achieving, if you like, in the school system, of course, because the school system was different, and so on. Sally Tomlinson, the professor of the sociology of special education, was also very interested in this issue as well, and wrote numbers of publications on the sociology of special education, thinking about, you see, once you've got these categories, it's quite convenient. I'm being, I guess, a bit cynical now, but it's quite convenient and speaking maybe a bit over the top, but it's quite convenient to be able to categorize particular children in particular ways. That means that they almost automatically are dispatched off to special institutions. Now, in 1978 came the Warnock Report, which radically changed the conceptualization of what creates barriers to learning. And this report introduced the notion of special educational need to replace categories. I often think to myself, well, Lady Warnock is a philosopher, so I guess if you look at the lens through which she and her committee were looking at issues of what creates barriers, then it's not surprising really that the concept of special educational need is quite complex and in some ways quite difficult to pin down. Up to 20% of the pupils might have a special educational need at some time in their school career. Now, those numbers come from a report of perceptions of learning difficulties in London and the Isle of Wight. There was a report that was written when they were looking at what proportions of young people experience learning difficulties. And they took two areas of the country, London, obviously because it's predominantly urban and so on, and the Isle of Wight, which is predominantly rural. So around up to 30% of children were seen as experiencing some kind of need in London, and around 15% on the Isle of Wight. And so to take an average is approximately 20%. That's where that came from. Now, in 1981, there was an Education Act which produced a legal definition of special educational needs. So I guess we all know this. A child has special educational needs if he, and it did say he, not she or they, but if he has a learning difficulty which calls for special educational provision to be made for him. It established the right of pupils with special needs to be educated in mainstream, and it informed the first code of practice. Now, I remember that code of practice being produced, and I think if we look at the difference between the time when the Education Act was written in 1981, it came into force in 1983. So there were 11 years, 1983 to 1994, when the code of practice, first code of practice, was published, when all sorts of things were going on in schools, but certainly not necessarily conforming to the spirit of the 1981 Education Act. Hence, the code of practice written on the model of codes of practice in industry, it represented statutory guidance to schools in relation to identifying, assessing, and meeting young people's special needs. As I've already mentioned, there was a global move towards human rights in the second half of the 20th century, spurred on, I guess, by what happened in the Second World War. In 1948, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1950 European Convention on Human Rights. 1989, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which includes the right to education. And this was adopted by the United Kingdom in 1991. So the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child is 1989. Articles 12 and 13, talking about the rights of the child, explicitly say children have a right to receive and impart information, to express an opinion, and to have that opinion taken into account in any matters affecting them from their early years. Their views should be given due weight according to their age, maturity, and capability. This is the root of the law, which has been reinforced over time since then. But this is the root of the law that says when we are working with children who experience difficulties of any sort, those children have the right to be heard, to express an opinion and have the opinion taken into account. In Britain, human rights are protected by the Human Rights Act, 1998. Basic rights based on shared values like dignity, fairness, equality, respect, and independence. That quotation comes from a publication called What Are Human Rights? The Equal Rights Commission. Currently, in 2024, there are two sets of relevant legislation. There is disability equality law, and there is education law related to special educational needs and disability. Both relate to human rights, and both relate to the principle of equity to enable access. Now, equality of opportunity, I think this is partly my interpretation, but certainly other people's interpretation as well. If we look at the two, equality of opportunity and equity, equality of opportunity implies treating everybody the same, as if you treat everybody the same, they all have equal opportunities. But actually, when we think about children who are disabled or children who experience other sorts of difficulties, some need extra to enable access to the curriculum, and that constitutes the principle of equity. So I've borrowed this from the internet. Equality, then, all three young people have the right to look at the baseball game that's going on, but we need different heights of boxes or different heights of ladders or whatever to enable all three of them actually to access the game. Disability equality legislation, then, one of the legs, if you like, of the two laws, the two pieces of legislation that specifically relate to children with special needs and disability. There's the 2010 Equality Act. It is illegal to discriminate against students with protected characteristics. There are a whole number of protected characteristics, of which disability is one. Now, what is disability? The definition is that disability is a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on that person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. I've noticed over the last, I'm sure it's not just me, but I've noticed since 2010, there's been an increasing emphasis on that particular piece of legislation in education. For example, dyslexia might, severe dyslexia might constitute a disability in this sense. And if it does, it is illegal to discriminate against students with dyslexia because it has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on a dyslexic child's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities in schools. Schools must make proactive, and the law says proactive, reasonable adjustments for disabled students to access the curriculum. So if a school knows that a child is coming into it who is dyslexic, they must make reasonable adjustments for those students. Now, obviously, there's a very grey area between those who are severely enough dyslexic and those who aren't. And that's one of the things about this kind of law, that to enforce it, you'd have to go to law and argue the case. And then if it was deemed that a particular pupil or group of pupils were disabled as a result of their dyslexia, it would constitute case law. Now, if schools must make proactive adjustments for disabled students, the implication is that schools can treat disabled pupils more favourably than non-disabled pupils, and in some cases they are required to do so. So we have to be really careful to be proactive. It's one of the reasons why schools are required to assess all pupils on entry to make sure that we know in advance what we have to do to ensure that we can meet their needs. The legal test is the test of reasonableness, and that in itself is very slippery. What is reasonable? The Education Law, the 2014 Children and Families Act, Part 3, Paragraph 20. What is a special educational need? It's virtually the same definition as originally used in 1981, except that there's an appreciation that not all pupils are of the male gender. A learning difficulty or disability that calls for special educational provision to be made for him or her, and I guess these days we would say or them. What is a learning difficulty? Significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of others of the same age. When I think about that, what it means in terms of assessment is that in order to show that a child has a learning difficulty that calls for special provision, we have to assess, and we have to assess for negative difference. And from a personal point of view, I think, well, how are we going to make sure that children who know that every time they're assessed for that negative, how are we going to maintain their motivation to continue to try? Now, what is a disability? Similar definition to 2010, a disability which prevents a student from making use of facilities of a kind generally provided for others of the same age in mainstream schools or mainstream post-16 institutions. Gets in the way then of access to the curriculum. Special provision additional to or different from what's made generally for others of the same age in mainstream educational institution. Have to be really careful about the issue of English as whatever one chooses to call it, an additional language or a second or third language or whatever, or children who are multilingual. A child or young person does not have a learning difficulty or disability solely because the language or form of language in which he or she or they is or will be taught is different from a language or form of language which is or has been spoken at home. Very clear distinction to be made between issues related to the language of somebody coming in whose first language is not English and an assumption that they have difficulties in learning. I must admit, and again, this is a personal view, I was particularly concerned when one of my students was talking about a friend of hers who came from another country and brought her children with her, and her 4-year-old daughter, this friend's 4-year-old daughter, had started at school, and when the friend went to school, she was told that the young girl was not meeting age-related expectations. She was being compared with everybody else, and her mother was being told she was so far below everybody else. She is a selective mute at school, but chatters till the cows come home, as they say, at home. But, you know, it's one of the issues to do with assessment and assumptions and so on about children with differences. Now, young people's rights to education and or training, the Children and Families Act. A local authority must carry out all its duties to children and young people with special needs or disabilities in its area with a view to helping them. Now, it is no longer helping them to access a satisfactory level of education. These days, it says helping them to achieve the best possible educational and other outcomes. So satisfactory is no longer good enough. It has to be to achieve the best possible. One human right, I think it's important to kind of reflect on this. One human right is that everybody has the right to an effective education. And that is stated in the Equality and Human Rights Commission publication of 2016. Everybody has the right to an effective education. However, the courts, this has gone to law, the courts have ruled that the right to education under human rights legislation relates to the education system that already exists. This is obviously really important when we consider learners who experience difficulties. They have the right to an effective education within the system that already exists. So I guess when you think about a context of competition and league tables and all the rest of it, it's pretty problematic. Now, Section 19, Part 3 of the 2014 Act requires the views, wishes, and feelings of children and parents to be central to every decision that's made in assessing a need and what to do about it. And that goes back, as we've already said, to human rights legislation. Not to do so, in other words, not to take account of views, wishes, and feelings of children and families is illegal and can be open to challenge. Of course, it's all very well saying it's illegal, but what anybody would have to do if they were concerned about this and they couldn't persuade a school or the local authority that actually they were breaking the law, if they weren't taking this into account, they'd have to go to court. School or college staff must tell the parent if a young person has been identified as having special needs, whether or not they have a plan. They must identify their needs to the best of their ability, and they must put the right support in place to make sure they make progress and achieve specified outcomes. All information should be documented in a clear record, should be available to the parents, carers, and families on request. That is the law. Entitlement, we often have questions about whether children should come to our school or not. I was running a Senko course and this question came up so often. Who is entitled to mainstream schooling? And the law, again, the 2014 Act, a child shall be educated in mainstream unless it is not compatible with A, the wishes of the parent or the young person, or B, the provision of efficient education for others. A local authority or the school governors can argue against this. In other words, they can argue that they are not willing to take a child into a school only if they can show that there are no reasonable steps that they could take to prevent the incompatibility. So the child's parent, carer, or family, and the young person has the right to express their wishes about the school, and efficient education needs to be provided for others. Schools should identify children with special needs and disability, support children from within their own resources under special needs support, or the child may have a plan. They must record what special needs they've identified a child as having, the outcomes they expect the child to achieve, and what provision is put in place to reach those outcomes in a special needs support record. There are lots of implications for the kind of record keeping, or rather the content of record keeping of schools in relation to special needs and disability. In relation to the code of practice, there's a new one. Every time they change the law, they issue a new code of practice. This was a second version, slightly amended, was issued in 2015. The schools and other institutions must have regard to the content of the code of practice. Now, have regard means Schools should do what should follow the guidance in the code of practice, or be able to explain why they haven't and the alternative that's been put into place instead, and show why the alternative is just as good as what is recommended. Mainstream state schools and academies should assess everybody's levels of attainment on entry, identify pupils making less than expected progress, plan for 4 broad areas of need, and ensure staff have relevant training and are equipped to respond. These are the 4 areas of need: communication and interaction, cognition and learning, social, emotional and mental health, sensory and or physical needs. I would guess that telling schools that they should be proactive in making sure that their staff are capable of addressing these 4 areas of need comes from originally the 2010 Equality Act, that says that schools should be proactive in making arrangements in advance of children arriving at their school. So special needs support then in schools: assess, plan, do, review, assess class or subject teacher, plan where pupils continue to make inadequate progress. The class teacher working with the SENCO should assess whether the child has significant difficulties, and in an individual education plan, it's very, what's the word? Structured, and there is detailed guidance given about what should be in a plan. It should describe in detail what additional support needs are like, so the nature of them, ways in which the needs are to be met, what learning outcomes are to be achieved, and additional support that's required, and a date when the plan will be reviewed. So it's very logical. What are the needs? How are they going to be met? What learning outcomes are to be expected? This actually has come in more recent years, really, the learning outcomes to be achieved and what additional support there is. So assess, plan, do. The class or subject teacher should work closely with the TAs or specialist staff, and the SENCO should support the teacher. Review. Review should, this is cyclical. Review should inform feedback into an analysis of the child's needs. There's a requirement to meet with parents and families 3 times a year. It suggests reviews will be at least termly. So that's the requirement, 3 times a year to review a plan. Any decision to involve a specialist must involve parents, carers, families. Schools must provide an annual report to families in a format that's accessible. We've said should talk to families at least 3 times a year if the pupil is receiving a special needs support. You know, on the SENCO course, I often had a question about, well, how are we going to contact and talk with families who are difficult to reach? And that is an issue which I know lots of people, of course not everyone, and it's not the majority, but a lot of people face. My advice, for what it's worth, was to make sure that they record all the efforts they make to meet families and to communicate with families. Schools should keep record of outcomes, actions, support agreed, and share this with families, and should share with all appropriate school staff. And provision made for special needs support should be recorded accurately and kept up to date. A very strong focus on reporting then. The thing is, if schools don't have a record of all the efforts they've made to support a child, and the fact that the child is still not making progress as a result, despite a meticulous reporting and meticulous planning and so on, it's very unlikely, in my experience, that however serious the child's needs, that a child then will be assessed for an EHC plan, because the question is always going to be, well, what's the school done so far? Schools should support young people with special needs either from their own resources up to a threshold of £6,000, or where the need requires a higher level of resourcing through an education, health and care plan. EHC needs assessments, which are done by the local or through the local authority, can only be requested for educational needs, not solely for health and or care needs. Schools should trigger an EHC needs assessment where they can't meet a child's needs if they don't have the expertise or funding to identify those needs fully, or to identify provision or support that the child requires. This is the law. It doesn't always happen. We know that. And they should trigger an assessment when they know what the child's needs are, what provision should be put in place, but they can't make that provision. And an EHC plan must specify the child, and it's really important this, what the needs are, the outcomes that are sought, the provision required to meet needs, health and care provision reasonably required, which result in him, her, or them having special needs, social care provision reasonably required, which result in the child or young person having special needs if provision is not already specified. Anything missing from here means that the plan is not legally compliant. The parent, family, or carer, or the learner has the right to request a particular school to be named in an EHC plan. Now, the local authority must consult the governors of the school about admitting the young person and name the school in an EHC plan, unless it would be unsuitable for the age, ability, aptitude, or special needs of the learner, or unless the attendance of the learner would be incompatible with the efficient education of peers or the efficient use of resources. That is what the law says. Actually, putting that into effect is not always very straightforward. It depends on all sorts of issues to do with resources mainly, but to do with other issues as well. Personal budgets. This is another area that caused some eyebrows to be raised when it was first introduced. The local authority is obliged to consider identifying a personal budget for educational provision for a child or young person if the parent requests it when they are carrying out an EHC needs assessment or when they're reviewing a plan. Now, when they first introduced personal budgets, they were not ring-fenced, but they quickly found that they really did need to ring-fence the budget in relation to the way that the money was being spent. The personal budget is a notional amount of money that would be needed to cover the cost of making the special provision specified in the EHC plan. However, a head teacher or principal has a veto if they don't agree to a direct payment being made for special educational provision, which would need to be delivered in their school or college. For example, if the families were insisting that a particular program was run that the school disagreed with for particular reasons, or, for example, amongst other things, that they were insisting that a particular person was hired to carry out the intervention. current statistics, the percentage of pupils with an EHC plan has increased to 3.7%, continuing a trend of increases since 2017, not surprisingly, given the increased focus of competition between schools and places on league tables and so on. The percentage with special needs but no plan has increased from 12.1 to 12.2. The most common type of need for those with a plan is autistic spectrum disorders. These days, more often, that's what it says in the code of practice or whatever, but more often now called autistic spectrum conditions, around 30%. The most common type of need for those with special needs support is speech, language, and communication, followed by moderate learning difficulty, and they still use that term, and social, emotional, and mental health. And that number is increasing, has increased considerably as a result, or since COVID. I'm talking about social, emotional, mental health issues. And finally, there is a special educational needs and disability guide for parents. And I've called it What Every Senko Should Know, because parents are given particular advice on what to look for and what to ask for in relation to special needs and barriers to learning experienced by their children. So, thank you for listening.